They said, "We love you no matter what." But what they meant was, as long as you don't change. Now he's left picking up the pieces of a childhood where love was conditional and silence was the only way to keep the peace. Tommy Reeves learned to read the weather in his parents' faces before he could read actual books. At 4 years old, he could tell from the way his mother's smile tightened around the edges, whether his excitement about finger painting would be welcomed or met with gentle redirection toward quieter activities. He knew from the slight furrow in his father's brow whether his questions about how things worked would be answered with enthusiasm or patient tolerance. "We love you no matter what," his mother Carol would say when tucking him into bed each night. "You're our special boy, and nothing could ever change that." The words were warm and reassuring, spoken with genuine affection. But even at 4, Tommy sensed there were invisible rules attached to that love, boundaries he couldn't quite see but knew better than to cross. The Reeves family lived in a modest split-level house in Millbrook, a suburb where lawns were maintained with religious devotion and children were expected to be seen more than heard. Carol worked part-time as a church secretary, and his father, Richard, managed the local hardware store. They were pillars of their community, reliable, respectable, and devoted to maintaining harmony at all costs. Harmony, Tommy learned, was the highest virtue in the Reeves household. It meant not arguing, not complaining, not expressing emotions that might disturb the careful equilibrium his parents had established. It meant being grateful for what you had, and not asking for things that might create stress or conflict. "Tommy's such a good boy," visitors would comment. "So well-behaved and polite." Carol and Richard would beam with pride, their validation confirming that they were raising their son correctly. Tommy absorbed these interactions, understanding that his value lay in being easy to manage, pleasant to be around, and careful not to cause problems. The first crack in this system appeared when Tommy was 7 and developed an intense interest in dinosaurs. He checked out every book the library had on paleontology, memorized the names of dozens of species, and could recite facts about the Mesozoic era, with the enthusiasm that other children reserved for cartoons. "Did you know that velociraptors were actually only about the size of a turkey?" Tommy announced at dinner one evening, his fork forgotten as he launched into an explanation of how Hollywood had gotten dinosaur sizes wrong. "That's nice, honey," Carol replied, but Tommy caught the quick glance she exchanged with Richard. "Maybe we could talk about something else while we eat." "But Mom, this is really interesting. And did you know that T-Rex probably had feathers? Scientists found—" "Tommy," Richard interrupted gently but firmly, "your mother asked you to change the subject. We can talk about dinosaurs later." Later never came. When Tommy tried to share his dinosaur facts during car rides, his parents would redirect the conversation to schoolwork or weekend plans. When he asked for dinosaur books for his birthday, he received educational workbooks and clothes instead. "We want to encourage well-rounded interests," Carol explained, when Tommy expressed disappointment. "It's not healthy to become too obsessed with one thing." The message was clear. His passion was too much, too intense, too disruptive to the peaceful family dynamic they valued. Tommy learned to keep his dinosaur enthusiasm private, sharing it only with librarians who seemed genuinely interested in his questions. This pattern repeated throughout Tommy's childhood with various interests and expressions of individuality. When he became fascinated with astronomy and wanted to stay up late to watch meteor showers, he was told that maintaining a consistent bedtime was more important than indulging phases. When he expressed interest in learning guitar after hearing a song that moved him, his parents worried about noise complaints from neighbors and suggested piano lessons instead, which were promptly canceled after Tommy struggled to connect with classical music. "We just want what's best for you," Richard would say whenever Tommy seemed disappointed by these redirections. "We've been around longer, and we know that what seems important now might not matter later." Tommy began to understand that love in his family came with terms and conditions that were never explicitly stated but always enforced. Love meant conforming to his parents' vision of who he should be. Love meant not challenging their decisions or expressing desires that created inconvenience. Love meant being grateful for what was offered rather than asking for what was wanted. School became both a refuge and another arena where Tommy learned to navigate the complexities of conditional acceptance. He was a bright student who enjoyed learning, but he quickly discovered that intellectual curiosity had to be expressed within acceptable parameters. When his third-grade teacher, Mrs. Peterson, encouraged students to ask questions about the solar system unit they were studying, Tommy's hand shot up immediately. "Mrs. Peterson, if the universe is expanding, what is it expanding into? And what was there before the Big Bang?" Mrs. Peterson paused, clearly unprepared for such philosophical depth from an 8-year-old. "Those are very advanced questions, Tommy. Maybe we should focus on learning the names of the planets first." Tommy's classmates giggled, and he felt the familiar flush of having been too much. too intense, too curious for the situation. He learned to moderate his questions, to ask simpler things that wouldn't draw attention or make adults uncomfortable. At home, parent-teacher conferences became exercises in managing his parents' anxiety about his intensity. Tommy is very bright, Mrs. Peterson told Carol and Richard during their fall conference, but sometimes his questions can be quite sophisticated. I wonder if you've considered having him tested for the gifted program? Carol and Richard exchanged one of their silent communications before Richard responded. We appreciate that Tommy is doing well, but we're not interested in pushing him academically. We think it's more important for him to have a normal childhood. Normal became another code word in the Reeves family vocabulary. Normal meant not standing out too much, not asking for special accommodations, not pursuing interests that made other people uncomfortable. Normal meant fitting in rather than excelling, blending in rather than shining. Tommy internalized these lessons so thoroughly that by middle school, he had become an expert at self-editing. He learned to express enthusiasm in measured doses, to ask questions that wouldn't challenge authority, and to pursue interests that aligned with his parents' comfort zone. When a science teacher encouraged him to enter a regional science fair, Tommy was excited about the possibility of investigating questions that genuinely intrigued him, but when he mentioned it at dinner, his parents' response was predictably cautious. Science fair sounds like a lot of extra work, Carol said. Are you sure you want to take on something so time-consuming? You're already doing well in your regular classes. But Mom, I have this idea about testing how different types of soil affect plant growth and— Tommy, Richard interrupted, we don't want you to overcommit yourself. It's better to do a few things well than to spread yourself too thin. The science fair opportunity was quietly discouraged until Tommy withdrew his interest. His teacher seemed disappointed, but Tommy had learned not to fight battles he couldn't win. This pattern of subtle discouragement whenever Tommy showed initiative or passion became so ingrained that he stopped recognizing it as problematic. He assumed all families operated this way, that love meant protecting children from disappointment by limiting their ambitions, that caring meant steering them away from pursuits that might lead to failure or unwanted attention. High school brought new challenges as Tommy's peers began asserting independence and exploring identity in ways that created friction with their families. Tommy watched classmates argue with their parents about curfews, clothing choices, and college plans, fascinated by their willingness to engage in conflict. My parents are driving me crazy, his friend Jake complained during lunch. They want me to take AP Calculus, but I hate math. We had this huge fight last night about my schedule. Tommy couldn't imagine having a huge fight with his parents about anything. Disagreement in the Reeves household was handled through gentle pressure, disappointed sighs, and the withdrawal of warmth until compliance was achieved. When Tommy expressed interest in taking AP English because he enjoyed writing, his parents' response followed the familiar pattern. That sounds like a lot of pressure, Carol said. Regular English has served you well so far. Why fix something that isn't broken? But I really like writing, and Mrs. Rodriguez thinks I have potential. Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't know you the way we do, Richard said with finality. We know what you can handle, and we don't want you to get overwhelmed. Tommy had learned not to push back against these decisions, but something inside him was beginning to rebel against the constant minimization of his capabilities and interests. He began writing in a journal, pouring out thoughts and feelings that he couldn't express aloud. Sometimes I feel like they love an idea of me more than the actual me, he wrote during his junior year. They say they want me to be happy, but they only seem happy when I'm being exactly who they think I should be. The journal became Tommy's secret rebellion, a place where he could explore thoughts and feelings that were too intense, too complicated, or too potentially disruptive for family consumption. He wrote about his frustration with being treated as fragile, his desire to take risks and face challenges, and his growing awareness that his parents' protection felt more like limitation. College applications brought these tensions to a head. Tommy had secretly researched schools with strong creative writing programs, dreaming of studying literature and honing his craft. But when it came time to discuss his college plans, his parents had already formed their opinions. State University has an excellent business program, Richard announced during a family meeting about Tommy's future. It's affordable, close to home, and will give you a solid foundation for any career. I was actually thinking about majoring in English, Tommy said quietly. Maybe creative writing or journalism. The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval, though neither parent raised their voice. Tommy, Carol said gently, we need to be practical. Writing is a nice hobby, but it's not a reliable career. We want you to have security and stability. But what if I'm really good at it? What if I could make a living writing? What if you can't? Richard countered. What if you spend 4 years studying something impractical and then struggle to find work? We'd hate to see you set yourself up for disappointment. The conversation that followed was frustrating in its circularity. Every point Tommy made about his passion for writing was met with counter-arguments about practicality and security. Every example he offered of successful writers was dismissed as exceptional cases that didn't apply to normal people like him. "We just want you to be realistic," Carol concluded. "We love you too much to let you make decisions you might regret later." Tommy found himself agreeing to apply to State University with a business major, but something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his family dynamic. He began to see how his parents' love was always coupled with control, how their support came with the expectation that he would choose the path they preferred. The realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it explained years of feeling vaguely suffocated and misunderstood. Devastating because it meant confronting the possibility that his parents' love was more conditional than he had ever wanted to admit. During his senior year, Tommy began to experiment with small acts of autonomy. He signed up for a creative writing elective without telling his parents until after the schedule was finalized. He joined the school newspaper and started submitting articles that reflected his own voice rather than what he thought others wanted to hear. The response at home was swift and subtle. His parents didn't forbid his activities, but they expressed constant worry about his changing and becoming someone they didn't recognize. "You seem different lately," Carol said one evening. "More rebellious. We're worried about these new influences in your life." "I'm not rebelling, Mom. I'm just trying things that interest me." "But why do you need to try new things? You've always been such a content, well-adjusted child. We don't understand why you're suddenly dissatisfied with everything." The question revealed the crux of their misunderstanding. Tommy's parents had interpreted his compliance as contentment, his silence as satisfaction. They genuinely believed they had been giving him everything he needed because he had never complained loudly enough for them to hear. "I wasn't content," Tommy said, surprising himself with his directness. "I was just quiet about being discontent. But you never said anything, because when I did say things, you changed the subject or redirected me toward something else. I learned that my interests weren't welcome if they didn't match what you thought was appropriate." The conversation that followed was the first time Tommy had directly confronted his parents about their patterns of behavior. It was uncomfortable, painful, and necessary. Carol was genuinely shocked to learn that Tommy felt stifled and controlled. "We were trying to protect you," she insisted. "We wanted to save you from disappointment and help you make good choices." "But they weren't my choices," Tommy replied. "They were your choices for me. There's a difference." Richard struggled with the implication that their parenting approach had been harmful. Every parent guides their children's decisions. That's what responsible parenting looks like. "Guiding is different from deciding," Tommy said. "You never asked what I wanted. You just told me what I should want, and then got upset when I had different ideas." The discussions continued sporadically throughout Tommy's senior year, with his parents slowly beginning to recognize how their well-intentioned control had affected their son. But change was difficult for all of them. When Tommy was accepted to State University, he also secretly applied to and was accepted by several schools with strong English programs. The decision about which offer to accept forced a final confrontation about autonomy and conditional love. "I'm going to Northern State," Tommy announced at dinner one evening. "They have an excellent creative writing program, and they offered me a partial scholarship." "Tommy, we never discussed Northern State," Richard said. "We agreed that State University was the best choice. You decided State University was the best choice. I never agreed to anything." "But Northern State is 3 hours away," Carol protested. "And creative writing isn't practical." "It's practical for me because it's what I'm good at and what I care about," Tommy interrupted. "I'm 18 years old and I need to start making my own decisions, even if they're mistakes." The argument that followed was unlike anything the Reeves family had ever experienced. Voices were raised, tears were shed, and accusations were made. It was messy, uncomfortable, and completely necessary. "We feel like we don't know you anymore," Carol said through her tears. "You're becoming someone we don't recognize." "I'm becoming who I actually am," Tommy replied. "The person you thought you knew was just me trying to be who you wanted me to be." The words hung in the air like a revelation and an indictment. Richard struggled with the idea that their love had been conditional. "We've always loved you exactly as you are." "No," Tommy said gently but firmly. "You loved me as long as I was who you wanted me to be. The moment I started expressing different interests or opinions, you tried to change me back." The recognition was painful for all of them, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of relationship. Tommy did attend Northern State University, where he thrived in the creative writing program and discovered a passion for journalism that led to internships and eventually a career as a freelance writer. His parents visited occasionally, and their relationship slowly evolved from one based on compliance to one based on mutual respect. The process wasn't smooth or quick. Carol and Richard had to learn to love their son as he actually was, rather than as they had imagined he should be. Tommy had to learn to express his needs and boundaries clearly, rather than expecting others to read his mind. During his sophomore year, Tommy wrote an essay about growing up in a household where love was conditional on conformity. The piece was published in the University Literary Magazine and later picked up by a national publication about family relationships. I learned that "we love you no matter what" often means "we love you as long as you don't change," he wrote. I learned that silence isn't peace. It's the absence of authentic communication. I learned that protecting someone from disappointment often means protecting yourself from discomfort. The essay generated responses from readers who recognized their own family dynamics in Tommy's story. Many shared experiences of conditional love disguised as protection, of having their authentic selves slowly eroded by families who claimed to want their happiness, while systematically discouraging anything that deviated from predetermined expectations. Tommy's parents read the essay and had their own difficult conversations about the gap between their intentions and their impact. They began therapy to understand how their own upbringings had shaped their parenting approach and to learn new ways of supporting their son without controlling him. "We really thought we were doing what was best for you," Carol said during one of their conversations. "We grew up in families where children didn't question their parents' decisions, where love meant obedience and gratitude." "I know you had good intentions," Tommy replied, "but good intentions don't erase the impact of making someone feel like they have to choose between being authentic and being loved." The healing process took years and required ongoing effort from everyone involved. Tommy had to learn to trust that his parents could love him without trying to change him. His parents had to learn to support their son's choices even when those choices made them uncomfortable. Gradually, their relationship transformed. Tommy felt free to share his successes and struggles without worrying about being redirected toward different goals. His parents learned to ask questions about his interests rather than immediately offering alternatives. When Tommy published his first book at 26, a collection of essays about identity and family, his parents attended the launch reading. Sitting in the audience, listening to their son read his work to an appreciative crowd, they felt a complex mixture of pride and regret. Pride because Tommy had become exactly who he was meant to be, a thoughtful, articulate writer who helped others process their own complex family relationships. Regret because they realized how much of his journey they had initially tried to prevent. "We almost cheated ourselves out of knowing who you really are," Richard said after the reading. "We were so focused on who we thought you should be that we nearly missed who you actually are." Tommy had learned that authentic love requires space for people to grow and change, even if that growth leads them away from what others had envisioned for them. He had learned that conditional love, no matter how well-intentioned, is ultimately a form of emotional manipulation that stunts everyone involved. Most importantly, he had learned that breaking the patterns of conditional love requires courage from everyone in the relationship. Children must be willing to disappoint their parents by being authentic. Parents must be willing to love their children even when that means letting go of their own dreams and expectations. The silence that had once characterized the Reeves household, the careful avoidance of topics that might create conflict, had been replaced by honest communication that sometimes led to disagreement, but always led to deeper understanding. Tommy's story became a reminder that "we love you no matter what" should mean exactly that. Love without conditions. Love that celebrates authenticity rather than demanding conformity. Love that creates space for people to become who they're meant to be, rather than insisting they remain who others want them to be. The pieces of his childhood that Tommy had to reassemble weren't broken because his parents were malicious or uncaring. They were broken because love had been offered with terms and conditions that made authentic self-expression feel dangerous and unwelcome. Healing meant learning that real love doesn't require people to minimize themselves to maintain peace. Real love creates space for growth, celebrates individuality, and finds ways to support people in becoming their authentic selves, rather than requiring them to remain static and manageable. The boy who had learned to read the weather in his parents' faces had grown into a man who understood that love should create sunshine, not storms that required constant navigation. And that understanding had transformed not just his own life, but his family's understanding of what love could and should look like.